Hello everyone, I'm Mahima, Head of Content at ThreadSol, and I welcome you all to our first of its kind panel discussion webinar on changes in business tactics for the apparel industry after GST. This webinar has been brought to you by Mosmi Ambastha's Stitch Diary, an educational blog for the apparel industry, and powered by ThreadSol, world's fastest growing technology company in the apparel space. Today, we have two very powerful panelists from the global apparel industry who will be discussing on the topic. So I would like to welcome our first speaker, Mr. Anuj George, who is the country head India at ThreadSol. Anuj has been a part of this industry for the past 8 years with immense experience in apparel manufacturing and consulting in apparel operations. He has done various plant setup projects and re-engineering and process improvements for a variety of factories in Bangladesh, India, Ethiopia, and China. So welcome on board, Anuj. Our second speaker is yet another powerful expert from this industry, Mr. Navdeep Singh Sodhi. He's the International Strategic Management Consultant at Gherzi Textile Organization, which is an industrial consulting company from Zurich. His expertise includes strategy, international trade and investment, and products and technology. He consults for international development institutions and the corporate textile industry organizations worldwide. So welcome on board, Navdeep.
Thank you.
Before starting this webinar, I would like to put forward the flow of discussion with all our attendees. Mr. Anuj and Mr. Navdeep will be discussing on the idea, implementation, and scope of GST in the Indian textile and apparel industry. I would like to request all the attendees to keep their earphones handy for their convenience. Attendees are also requested to keep all their questions or statements for the Q&A round at the end of this discussion, wherein you can type your questions in the chat box and the panelists will be happy to answer them. The session is being recorded and we will be sending you a discussion for your own purposes to share with others. All right, so without wasting any time, let's start with a bit of introduction and numbers of our Indian textile and apparel industry. So the textile industry in India is one of the key sectors in Indian economy with a direct linkage to the overall growth of India. It is one of the oldest manufacturing industries in India and the second largest industry after agriculture, which provides skilled and unskilled employment. The textiles and apparel industry accounts for about 10% of manufacture or production and 2% of India's GDP, and constitutes about 13% of country's export earnings, which is a very big number. So I would now like to ask Anuj to throw some light on the various tax regimes and then the mighty implementation of GST in the system.
Thank you, Mahima, for organizing this. I'll start this discussion with a little insight into how it was working earlier. As we all know, India was earlier in Inspector Raj economy where everything was redlined and there was a tape and approval and a sanction kind of a process. That changed in early 90s with the economic reforms. But what happened basically was that the taxation still was decentralized. Which meant that all the states had different tax regimes for different areas, and they had octroys, and they had state entry taxes, and they had sales taxes, and they had a lot of other excise taxes, and the rates and everything was different from for every state. This basically, so when I joined this government industry and started working as a merchandiser, so I had to learn a lot of things, which was excise duties and the sales taxes and the sales returns and the C forms. So to apply for a tax or to get the input credit for any tax was way too difficult, and it was completely haywire. Like if I was getting a mill-made fabric from Surat, the sales tax would be something different. Whereas if I was getting it from, let's say, Ludhiana or Tirupur, it would be different. So there was a little requirement for it to be centralized and streamlined. that is where the entire idea of GST implementation started, or the need for a streamlined taxation was there. Yeah.
Right. Navdeep, would you like to add to Anuj's pointers?
Yeah, I mean, to echo what Anuj said, I mean, we've had one of the most complex tax regimes, to say the least. And in case of the textile and apparel value chain, because it's a complex value chain, much different from many other industries. So a complex tax structure at, three tiers of the government: local, state, and federal. That's the central, plus the complexity of the fragmented textile industry, which has power looms, handlooms. You have the organized mill sector, and then on top of that there are the issues relating to different fibers, because there are different rates applicable to different fibers, natural and man-made. So it was quite a complex system. So GST is really meant to simplify this structure, but at the same time, the issues relating to implementation, and also the issues relating to the peculiar nature of this industry, probably they need to be understood better by the policy makers. So we should come to this when we discuss more about implementation and what's really happening on the ground.
Right, right. But I think let us first start with the positive side of GST. I completely agree that it has come as a bolt for a lot of people in the industry because the sector is unorganized. But there are some advantages also which people feel. So can you please throw some light on the advantages and the most important features of GST implementation?
Yeah, the most important advantage is that the tax system has been brought under one umbrella. So you do not have to deal with the multiple authorities and multiple tiers of the government. So this is really the biggest advantage, But this is a generic advantage. It's not really unique to the textile industry. The second major advantage is a seamless flow of the goods across the country. And in textiles, I mean, the goods deal with fashion. So, for the goods to reach the markets on time, this is one of the critical factors, and because a lot of inventory is blocked and then the goods cannot reach on time according to the season and so on. So now that the goods can flow seamlessly across states, the time and locked up in logistics has been seriously brought down. So this is another big advantage. Then the third big advantage is, which will happen over a long period of time, is the consolidation of the industry. Obviously, in the short run, there is going to be some pain as the SMEs are going to bear the brunt of most of the implementation issues. But in the long run, I mean, the companies which can reach some scale and a level of integration, they should benefit, and not only would they benefit, it will lead to the overall improvement in the competitiveness of the industry, as we have seen in other countries, especially China. So these I would count as, the three major benefits: the short, medium, and long term.
Right. I would also like to ask you guys that after this GST implementation, do you think the exports will get a boost? Because right now, currently, there was duty drawback, which was in the picture, and which made the procedure of export delayed. So do you think exports will get a boost in India?
Anuj, may I take this question?
Yeah, please go ahead, please.
Yeah, see, exports is a slightly different issue. Of course, it's connected with the GST, but it does not really reflect the situation of the whole textile industry. Unfortunately, with regard to exports, there are some serious issues, and unless these are tackled by the government in the right earnest, I mean, we should see a major distress in this sector. If you have watched last month's export figure, it has already shown a steep decline, in the total apparel exports from the country. So this is not really a good sign. Okay, let's try to understand what are the export-specific issues. There are, I would say, 2 to 3 issues. The first issue is that, by principle, exports are zero rated. What it means is that you would have paid duty on the inputs that you have used in your export production, but you cannot pass on these duties to your customer who's a foreign buyer. This is the basic fiscal principle of export, indirect taxes, that exports are zero rated. So this means that you have to charge a notional tax in your invoice, but you cannot pass it on to the customer. Now, this leads to an accumulation of input taxes which an exporter would have paid, but is unable to claim immediately from the government. So therefore, a significant amount of his working capital gets locked up in the system, the government has already recognized it. They have assured that they will try to speed up this system. But as you know, in government, it's difficult to speed up certain things. And imagine if an exporter has about, $10 million of export every month, and there is, a 15 or even 12% duty element on inputs in that, and refund of that will happen after 6 months. This will really play havoc with the exporters' working capital. So this is issue number 1. That's the liquidity issue. The second issue has been a rather abrupt, although it was expected, but the industry had expected a soft landing or some kind of a transitional mechanism. So from 1st October, the duty drawback rates have been cut significantly from, for example, from a level of about 9 to 10% to just about 2%, So this has, been a huge shock to the industry, which had requested for a certain, transitional mechanism to allow the industry to absorb and understand the GST and then gradually, get adjusted to working without the drawback rates, Now, this is not happening, and as you know, export is not 1 or 2 transactions. Usually the exporters have orders which are for 3 months or 6 months and so on. So the prices get locked in and the drawback benefits would have already been factored into the exporters' costing. So suddenly when they find that, the drawback has been slashed from 9% to 2%, this will actually, put companies in the red, And one tiny issue before I come out of subject is that, a few months ago, the government had also introduced a scheme which was called ROSL, or refund of state level duties. Because usually the all India duty drawback rates only take into cognizance, the refund of duties which are at the central level. But recently the state level duties were also incorporated, but that was restricted only for the apparel and made-ups sector. So for example, the textile industry, that is, yarn, fabrics, etc., was not included in that, Now this is an issue, because India has a significant amount of fabric export as well, So the fabric exporters, when they have to absorb the cost of the state level duties, this would actually, make them uncompetitive. Just for the audience to understand, there are about various kinds of state level duties. Major among them is the electricity duty, which is paid to the state electricity or the utility companies. And this is quite significant, amounting to something like 13 to 15%, depending on state to state. Second is the petroleum goods, the companies buy diesel, lubricants, etc. So on this also the duties. So if at the fabric stage these duties are not refunded, this will, further add to the, the lack of cost competitiveness in the industry, So to summarize, exports, especially of apparels, would be negatively impacted as a result of this development. And this is not something that the government wants, because the government wants to create jobs, and apparel is the industry, that really creates the jobs, So this is something, that needs to be addressed, squarely. Mehma?
Mehma, can't hear you. Yeah, I'll till the time Mahima joins in, I'll add in a couple of points to what Navdeep said. So adding on to I perfectly agree to what Navdeep said, and the apparel exports basically in different clusters, for example, let's say in Tirupur, have been terribly affected. The manufacturers there are reeling under a lot of pressure. Reason to which is the tax before GST on any textile products was zero in Tamil Nadu, and after GST it increased to 5%. So let's say that if it was GST was already planned, but these costs were not factored into the final product price of manufacturer. So let's say immediately if he has to increase the cost by 5%, he's already paying that cost, and not getting that cost back at the end of the cycle is a pain. And the other part is that, as Navdeep was trying to mention, that there are some states which will be manufacturing and will have a lock-in period. Apart from that, the other part is taxes are levied on specific states and specific industries so that they can improve upon the infrastructure of that particular industry. There are two types of states in India if we look at. So there are some which are manufacturing states, let's say let's say Haryana in terms of Gurgaon, an area where people manufacture clothes and all. And there are some states like Delhi which consume. So the consuming states will be the states where the tax is collected. Now, how the collected tax from the final consumer is divided among states and allocated for different infrastructural projects is something which is still under debate, where people have not been able to agree on specific points where how do we actually divide the tax that comes in back to allocate to that specific industry to develop it further. Yeah. So
these are obviously the government issues.
Yes. So these are a couple of points which I would say that are the negative side, which will affect the apparel or the garment industry because of GST. Mahima, over to you. Mahima, you have gone quiet, I guess.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Navdeep, would you like to add on to the points?
Yeah, I mean, I think Anuj pointed out the issues relating to, interstate issues and how will the revenue from GST be utilized. Well, these are, I believe these are the government issues. I mean, these would have to be addressed, once the GST is, it starts cruising and it's very much, embraced as the new system. I mean, at this moment, as we see, it is still very fluid, and every day, we are learning, and the administration is also trying to streamline the schemes as they get feedback from the stakeholders, And this is also an issue, I mean, rising above the technical issues. No business likes uncertainty and unpredictability. So this whole question marks about, whether drawback rates will be there or not, whether the refund will come in 3 months or the refund will come in 6 months, whether fabric would be included, what kind of returns. I mean, this really does not, this creates a lot of uncertainty, and in this uncertain period, it will be very difficult for the exporters and also the other mills which are selling in the domestic market to really, price their products effectively.
Right. Also, we are seeing a lot of compliance issues as well, because most of the apparel makers and wholesalers are not happy with it. because it's high rate and unwillingness of unregistered dealers to comply with the provisions of GST.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a major issue, and we must recognize that the textile and apparel chain in India, I mean, and in most countries, this is the nature of this industry.
This
It's
industry, right?
highly fragmented. 85% of our industry is in the hands of SMEs, which are like
Correct.
family-owned enterprises, and they are not used to any record keeping. They are not used to really paying taxes because they were not really in the tax bracket and so on. So this makes the whole paperwork and so on very complex for them. And I mean, this is something that we cannot wish away. Certainly the industry will not become organized and consolidated. This is a very long-term process. So there is a need to recognize these practical difficulties,
The implementation issues.
that's right, and try to simplify the implementation of GST so that I mean, people could, I mean, the firms even at the micro level could find the system customer friendly.
Right, right. Would you also like to throw some light on the various numbers, tax numbers of the various fibers, like silk and jute are totally freed from GST, while cotton and the man-made synthetic fibers are not. So what are the implications of these numbers for the market?
Yes, this is also an important issue, Mahima. Unlike in many countries, here we have still, kept that differentiation, or let me say discrimination, between natural and man-made fibers. For example, if we look at the rates, there are 4 stages. We have the fiber, then you have the intermediates, then there is fabric, and there is finished goods like apparels, or made-ups. Now, as far as the cotton value chain is concerned, it is 5% uniform up to garments, branded garments, for which the MRP is up to 1,000 rupees. Now, when it comes to the man-made fibers, there is a certain distortion, that there is an inverted rate structure. For example, the GST rate on fibers and yarns is 12%, whereas the rate on fabrics is 5%. Now, this becomes an issue when we understand how it will be applied. For example, if you are a fabric maker, you would have paid 12% duty on yarn or the basic raw materials that you purchased. Whereas when you sell the fabric, you can only charge 5% to your buyer. Now, so which means that the amount of accumulated duty on input tax, this will be quite high, and this will create liquidity issues for the fabric company. So this distortion between man-made and natural fibers, this is also causing a certain amount of difficulties or burdens, especially among the man-made fiber industry. And if we see worldwide, it is the man-made fiber industry which is growing much faster, and because it's used for mass consumption, so it's the masses, that wear fabrics which are made from synthetic fibers like viscose, polyester, and acrylic, and so on.
Right, right. All right, I'm really interested in knowing the methods or the ways by which the different members of the supply chain can overcome the difficulties of the GST regime.
Yes, I'll go for this, Mahima.
Sure, Anuj.
Yeah. So in this, what basically, how do we tackle is that earlier, as Navdeep was pointing out, a lot of these players were unorganized, and they do not have expertise. They do not believe in record keeping or maintaining records or financial data, which was one of the major reasons where the taxation in our country is not coming out. We are not able to tax every person who's earning. When we talk about converting an unorganized sector into an organized sector, yes, what do you say, a bat will be useful where we put and draw a line and say that anyone who after this date has to be organized and has to tax and has to have the records in a certain manner. That is one way to do it. Apart from that, what when we are trying to do that, what people are actually trying to debate is the cost for maintaining these records will go down because yes, it's a centralized with manner how we do it, and secondly, it will be a easier way to do it. But what we're trying to factor in over here is that people have not been doing that, and people need to actually employ people and understand how to take care of these issues and how to ensure that these things are taken care of. So yes, the first and foremost thing would be is to register the company and uh, get on to the side where we start paying taxes and uh, make this area more organized. But this will increase their cost, and they will have to look in to the part how they manage the uprising of, let's say, 5 to 7% because of the nullification of duty drawback and the introduction of GST in that cost. How they would be able to, how they should be controlling their cost so that they don't start becoming totally uncompetitive in the world stage.
Right. Navdeep, would you like to add on its pointers?
Yeah, I think there are also, Mehma, one is, of course, how is, the industry going to overcome some of these challenges? But there are certain issues, which also need to be resolved. And these are, administrative issues, Now, there are 2 or 3 topics, that I would like to highlight here. First issue is that, regarding the deadline for filing the returns. Obviously, as a result of the requests and the petitions made by the industry, the government has been extending the deadline, and I believe now the date has been extended until December of this year. Now, on the one hand, it provides some relief to the industry, that they've got more time to prepare. But at the same time, it also creates a lot of uncertainty, because the companies, until their tax returns are probably properly assessed, they are interpreted, and they are effectively refunded, they will not really know exactly, where do they stand. So theoretically, they'll be able to calculate, certain taxes that they will be able to, get a refund. That is the output minus input. But until it happens, it is still a matter of subject to, interpretation. So this creates a lot of uncertainty, which is beyond the control of, the industry. The second issue is also certain kind of an ad hocism in terms of the various forms that are being used, and certain changes in the formats and templates that have been introduced. I mean, basically, there are 3 types of, there are many types of form, but I would like to highlight, there are 3 major returns that need to be filed. One is called the GSTR1, which is for output GST. Then there is GSTR2, which is for the input VAT. Then there is this GSTR3, which is for, the net VAT or the net GST that the companies have to pay. And then a new return called GST3B was introduced recently, on a temporary basis. Now, this makes the system very complex and does not really simplify things, especially for the SMEs. Another issue that has come up, which is administrative in nature, is that in the old regime, when there was a state level VAT, the companies were able to automatically claim the input credit. But in the new regime or the new scheme, that's the GST scheme, a proper nexus has to be established between the buyer and the seller. For example, the buyer who's claiming an input tax refund, he will have to prove that the supplier from whom he has purchased the goods had indeed paid those duties and deposited it in the treasury, So this also becomes the responsibility of the buyer, Now this makes it much more complicated for him to deal with the situation, So there are these administrative issues which will be difficult for, especially the SMEs for the decentralized sector to be able to overcome themselves, This is a hard fact.
Correct. Points taken, Navdeep. I would now like to close this discussion with my last question, which we have answered more or less in the whole discussion, but this will be a good conclusion. Is GST the right step for the Indian apparel and textile industry? Are there any growth opportunities for the sector on the world map, or the future seems bleak?
Anuj, would you like to take that first?
I'm sure both of you have very good opinions about this.
Yes, so the future, see, the way to go forward is centralization of taxes and streamlining of it. But what I would say is that the implementation or the way that it has been rolled out is a little tricky on how we could have done a better job at rolling it out and handling it in a better way. That is something that I would like to say. But yes, the future is a little bleak for apparel industry with the taxes mounting up and the duty drawbacks rolling back and the labor costs and the other utility costs rising day by day. There are very less incentives right now for any garment or a textile manufacturer to actually set up or expand in India. That is actually a realistic pulse of the industry right now, and people would like to, like say, expand in Ethiopia or Bangladesh more. Like I've known Indian manufacturers who are trying to do that, than put up more units or let's say create more employment in India.
I mean, I would like to summarize that. Before that, there's one more issue which I want to rapidly flag is that there are two other issues, which the industry is expecting that would come up because it's already in the basic principles of GST. One is called an anti-profiteering clause. This has not been put into action yet, but in due course, this will become effective, The second is this e-waybill clause. So what this anti-profiteering clause means in simple words is that if a company is found to be not passing on the full benefit, it could be penalized. So this seems like a very punitive clause, The second is this e-waybill clause. Now, this could also, give more powers in the hands of the inspectors. I mean, the octroi posts would be gone, but the inspectors could stop the trucks on the way anywhere to, look for these e-waybills and so on, So this has created some sort of apprehensions in the minds of the industry. All right. Now, coming to, the overall pros and cons and how do we see the future. In the short run, the industry is certainly, faced with a lot of uncertainty, and especially, the apparel industry, which is, downstream and at the final end of the industry. The devil is really in the detail, and that's where, the player is looking at and more concerned about, how the system is implemented in the short run, while not losing, sight of the long-term advantages, So if we have to, summarize, I mean, GST is certainly good in the long run, but, these implementation issues, they certainly need to be addressed. Otherwise, our industry, which is really very fragmented, I mean, many of these gains could be lost, and these would be not really confined to our industry, but, far-reaching economic goals, So, the policy makers and all stakeholders, they really need to address these issues and see how could these be streamlined even in the short run to see that, we can mitigate, the hardship being faced by the industry. Mahima?
Yes. All right, gentlemen, I agree with all your points, and it was a really, really fruitful discussion on GST implementation for the apparel industry. I really hope that the GST structure helps turn this industry into an organized segment from the unorganized segment and be the biggest long-term benefit. I'm sure the audience has some questions for you guys. So can we quickly start with the Q&A session now? Dear audience, to make it easier, I would like to request you to put your questions in the chat box.
There is one comment which I've just seen from Navdeep Raj.
Correct. He asks, where do you see export of handloom and small unorganized weaving industry going after GST implementation?
Well, as we mentioned, highlighted, that the smaller players who are above this compliance limit, they would certainly find difficulties, in the short run. So certainly there will be issues, that need to be overcome. I mean, although the government has exempted, companies or the firms which are, up to a certain turnover from the GST implementation. So we'll really have to see the size. But in the short run, we certainly see some challenges, which will have to be encountered by the handloom weaving industry, just like the other apparel industry. So they are not really going to be immune from the pain in the beginning. So, through their associations, through their chambers, they certainly need to, highlight, the practical issues that they are facing so that they can be, streamlined by the policymakers. Yeah, thank you.
All right, audience, any more questions?
Okay, there's another question, Anuj, which you will see also on the screen. Which is concerning the difference between state and central GST.
This is basically
there are no central and state GST.
This is basically a kind of division between how it's supposed to be given. It's just one. So let's say it is 5% is the tax that is supposed to be levied on, let's say, your MACD bill. Then 2.5 will be under central GST and 2.5% will be under state GST. So it's just a header under the entire ambit.
Yeah, so the difference is really in the distribution of the revenue between the different arms of the government. So as far as the taxpayer or the industry is concerned, I mean, this doesn't really affect them because the overall rate, for example, on fabric being 5%, that remains 5%.
Any more questions, people? Okay, another question from Hira Kumar. Can we expect uniform and GST in fiber categories?
Well, this is really a very good question, and this is really a question, which has been debated for a long time in this country. And of course, recognizing this issue, the government already did something. I mean, if you recall, the rate on the man-made fiber chain earlier was 18%, whereas on cotton it was 5%. So the gap has already been reduced from 18% to 12%. But to expect that this will be completely eliminated, I mean, this has to do with a basic policy issue. And we believe that, or we feel that the man-made fiber industry, I mean, the whole value chain, not just upstream, they will need to, make their point heard at the government level. As far as, I mean, the macro view is concerned, we all know that two things, that number one, the future growth in man-made will be mainly from the man-made fiber sector, because the cotton production is limited. The second important thing is that the man-made fibers are consumed by the masses because these are affordable and in terms of price much lower than cotton fabrics. So therefore, both from the viewpoint of the industry as well as the consumers, there is a merit in considering uniformity in the rate, and also it will lead to simplicity. So certainly, Arushi Arora, who has raised this question, I mean, we are in full agreement with you on this point. Okay, there's another question you might want to take about the disadvantages for retailers after GST.
The disadvantages for retailers basically in the initial time is not having a clear clarity about how much taxation should they actually bill into their entire cost. But I feel that overall in the longer run, the domestic retailers will be actually benefited through GST, where the taxation will be more streamlined and taken care into the pot. So let's say if we tide over the initial 4 to 5 months or 6 months, or let's say the next 1 year, we should have a bit more clarity on how things will be in terms of GST under the different product categories, and this will actually help the retailers to have a certain streamlined tax structure across their products, which right now the retailers are facing a trouble any which way. So right now there's a little less clarity than before.
I think the main disadvantage, if it is a disadvantage, is the paperwork that they have to maintain, in the record keeping. But this is the way forward. In future, the business is more towards automation, towards transparency, and proper record keeping. So this is something inevitable, which sooner or later will have to be done. Mahima?
Yes. Audience, do you have any more questions, or should we close the discussion now? We are waiting. Okay, we have another question from Ramandeep. What will be the impact of GST on logistics and warehousing?
Yeah, this impact, as we see, will be quite positive. This is one of the gains and the dividends of GST, as we see. One is, as we said, that the transportation of the goods will become much more streamlined, that the trucks don't have to, queue up at every municipality or every district limits. So this will lead to reduction in the transportation costs, so more efficiency. And in terms of warehousing, it will lead to consolidation of warehousing rather than having smaller warehouses at different stock points or SKU keeping points. It will lead to creation of much bigger warehouses, much more automated and much more efficient warehouses. So eventually this will also lead to lower inventory costs. So Anuj, if you would like to echo any views on this.
No, that's aptly put. You had touched on this particular point earlier also. And
yes.
It resonates the same thing.
So, all right. So let's close the discussion for now. Would you guys like to add any points?
From my side, not really an addition, but just to recap, GST is a good system overall in the long run. But, as far as the textile and apparel industry is concerned, number one, due to, the complexity and the way that the value chain is structured in a fragmented way, it has certain unique challenges which need to be taken into consideration, and especially when it comes to the garment industry and the decentralized part of the industry, the government needs to be conscious of the issues that they are facing, and ensure that there is some kind of a transitional mechanism worked out to help them to be integrated with the GST, because textile industry is quite vital. I mean, it affects the lives of more than 10 crore people. So
Right.
the competitiveness of this industry and their they're fully embracing the new GST regime is quite important, and it requires some hand holding.
Correct. Thank you, Navdeep, for concluding the whole thing. And thank you to both our experts, Anuj and Navdeep, for giving out such good information to our audience. Much appreciated. Again, a big thanks to you both, Anuj and Navdeep. It was great to have you for the discussion.
Thank you, Mahima.
Thank you, Mahima. Thank you for steering it in spite of the tech challenges at the outset. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you and goodbye, all of you. We hope to do a webinar soon, and information will be circulated soon. Thank you.